بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, in today's class, we're going to backtrack just a little bit to talk about the issue of taking back a man taking back his wife. I rushed through that in the last class, and I had promised you that in this class we'll go over it. I mean, I'm not going to just repeat it, but I want to. There are a couple of details in the Hawashi that are important for me to mention to you. So we're going to learn a little bit about the waiting period, the iddah, how a man can take back his wife, what happens if a man divorces his wife. Once, for example, she remarries, divorces, and comes back, does she come back and resets the counter of the divorces, or does she come back with one divorce in the ledger? It's one divorce in the ledger, but we'll talk about that. So there are things like that that I just didn't get a chance to get to in the last lecture because we were rushing through it. So we'll cover those. And then we will take the next section, which is forswearing one's wife. And what that means is that a man would swear or make an oath that he's not going to approach his wife sexually, that is. So what happens after 4 months? Because that comes from the text of the Quran. So after 4 months, either the man has to engage in the sexual act and then by so doing ends that period, and if he had made an oath, he'll have to pay expiation for that oath, or he has to divorce his wife because it's not fair that he does that, puts his wife in that situation. Now what happens if he refuses to do either? This is a case in which the judge would intervene into the situation and then force the divorce and enact the divorce. Not an annulment, not a fasakh, but to force the divorce. So that's another issue that we will talk about. Again, it doesn't sound like these are rocket science issues. They're pretty straightforward, but as we always do, we'll take a little bit of time just to go through some of the adillah and some of the permeations that we might find that might be worth mentioning. So again, we'll backtrack to the section on taking one's wife back, and then we'll take the following section, which is forswearing one's wife, and those will be the major pieces of content for today's lecture. We'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the way we normally begin, just to turn to the original text of Abi Shuja' radiallahu anhu. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين أمين. فصل في الرجعة: وإذا طلق امرأته واحدة أو اثنتين فله مراجعتها ما لم تنقضي عدتها، فإن انقضت عدتها حل له نكاحها بعقد جديد وتكون معه على ما بقي من الطلاق. فإن طلقها ثلاثا لم تحل له إلا بعد وجود 5 شرائط: انقضاء عدتها منه، وتزويجها بغيره، ودخولها بها وإصابتها، وبينونتها منه، وانقضاء عدتها منه. فصل في الإيلاء: وإذا حلف أن لا يطأ زوجته مطلقا أو مدة تزيد على 4 أشهر فهو مول، ويؤجل له إن سألت ذلك 4 أشهر، ثم يخير بين الفيئة والتكفير أو الطلاق، فإن امتنع طلق عليه الحاكم. Okay, so some of that we've taken, but let's go back and look at the Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. If the husband has divorced his wife with once or twice, he may take her back as long as her waiting period has not expired. If the waiting period expires, he can marry her with a new contract. She will return with whatever number of divorces remain. If he divorces her 3 times, she remains unlawful for him until 5 conditions are met. Her waiting period from him expires. That's the first man, that is. Then she marries another man. Number 2. Number 3, the new marriage is consummated. Number 4, she is divorced from the new husband. And number 5, her waiting period from the new husband expires. Actually, that translation, that last part, could do better, because he says, rahimahullah, not that the waiting period, that's not the phraseology he uses, not that the waiting period is over. وَبَيْنُ نَتِهَا مِنْهُ, that she becomes ba'in from him. So it's not just that the waiting period ends, but there is a clear severing of the previous marriage, meaning that either the new man, divorced his wife 3 times, in which she is ba'in in that case, or he has divorced her once and the waiting period has ended. I mean, the translation is fine. I'm just saying that the word that he uses in the original text is a little bit, it's more precise to indicate that she has severed the previous marriage and there's no opportunity to go back either permanently or through a new contract. Okay, forswearing one's wife. If the husband forswears having intercourse with his wife forever, afwan. If the husband forswears having intercourse with his wife forever, or for a period exceeding 4 months, he has indeed forsworn her. If she requests separation, he is left alone for 4 months. He then chooses between breaking his oath and making an expiation or divorce. If he refuses, the judge issues a divorce from him. Okay, maybe there's no point of repeating the adillah that we took yesterday or in the previous class, but let's see what the new stuff is. Okay, we talked about verse 228, وَبَعُولَتُهُنَّ أَحَقُّ بِرَدِّهِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ إِنْ أَرَادُوا إِصْلَاحًا, that the man can take back his wife during the waiting period. And then this hadith is in Muwatta, that Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu asked the Prophet ﷺ about a man who's divorced his wife twice and she's finished her waiting period. And then she marries somebody else, and then that somebody else divorces her. And then the first one marries her again. So the Prophet ﷺ said, هي عنده بما بقي من الطلاق. She comes back to the first husband with what remains of the divorce. And we'll come to learn that this is one of the qawa'id of fiqh, one of the principles of fiqh, that the numbers of divorce are not reset until the full numbers are exhausted, meaning the 3, or in the case of a free person, or twice in the case of a slave. So even though, and that's, it's not like, it makes sense, but it's not necessarily intuitive. You wouldn't think about it on your own. A wife is divorced from husband, her first husband, let's say divorced once, or in the case of the hadith twice. She goes on, after the waiting period, she marries another man, lives with him for a year or two, there's a divorce, finishes her waiting period, and then the first husband wants to remarry her. Because she had not exhausted the 3 divorces, she comes back to him with already 2 strikes, 2 divorces. So if that first husband divorces her again, then it's a final divorce. So that's important. We'll get to that in the commentary. As far as remarrying, after the 3 divorces, she has to marry somebody else, consummate the marriage, etc. That's from verse 230 of Baqarah. فإن طلقها فلا تحل له من بعد حتى تنكح زوجا غيره فإن طلقها فلا جناح عليهما أن يتراجع إن ظن أن يقيم حدود الله. That's verse 230. So 228, 229, and 230 are the main verses that we've been talking about up until now. Okay, the ila. This is from verse in Baqarah 26 to 27. للذين يؤلون من نسائهم تربصوا 4 أشهر فإن فاءوا فإن الله غفور رحيم عزموا الطلاق فإن الله سميع عليم. So this is also in Baqarah. Sorry, not 26. That's a misprint in the book. That's my mushaf is not next to me, but let me get it for you. I think it's verse 260. sorry, I just sometimes the book has a misprint. This is we want to talk about uh, the verses of Ila. Why does he say 26 to 27? Maybe it's 226. Yes. للذين يؤلون من نسائهم تربصوا أربعة أشهر فإن فاءوا فإن الله غفور رحيم وإن عزموا الطلاق فإن الله سميع عليم. So this is verse 226 and 227. So let me actually just make the correction in my book. So next time we do this together, we're not mistaken. These are the verses that talk about ila in Surah Al-Baqarah. And then, okay, those are the main adillah that we need to cover. Sorry that prolonged a little bit. Let's go back, inshallah, now to the text and bring out the hashiyah so we have some guidance. Now we're talking about backtracking just a little bit, just to talk about taking back one's wife. So he says, rahimahullah, if the husband divorces his wife once or twice, he may take her back as long as her waiting period has not expired. So during the iddah, as we said, لَعَلَّ اللَّهُ يَحْدِثُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ أَمْرًا, Allah says in Surah Al-Talaq, maybe Allah Ta'ala will cause something to happen, which is that their feelings might turn towards one another, and they come back to one another. So that one of the wisdoms behind the waiting period is able to come back. Now, of course, as we've been talking, the waiting period is just the generic 3 menstrual cycles, but the waiting period can also be that she's pregnant and she gives birth, wad al-haml, and with that comes the waiting period, comes the end of the waiting period. So when we say waiting period, you got to be a little bit, flexible in your mind that it's not just that one scenario. Let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so the last thing I was saying there was about the waiting period. It could be 3 menstrual cycles. Of course, it also could be the giving birth. Now, I'm not mentioning the waiting period of the 4 months and 10 days of death, because then the man has died, so it doesn't count here. I mean, he can't come back to life and take her back after that. Okay. And then he says, rahimahullah, if the waiting period expires, he can marry her with a new contract. She will return with whatever number of divorces remain. So the waiting period ends, and as long as it's not the 3 irrevocable divorce pronouncements, then she can come back to him. But in this case, we will need a new contract. And in the new contract, all of the conditions that we talked about in the beginning of this book, or in the beginning of this chapter of marriage and divorce, that's when we would invoke those rules again. So she comes, the mahar, the wali, the witnesses, the sigha, ijab, qubul, all the stuff that we talked about before. Now, the one thing that I wanted to highlight is that she comes back with the same number of divorces in the ledger, as long as they have not been completed. لا يهدم الطلاق قبل استيفاء عدده. So the divorce does not negate the number of divorce does not negate the number of divorces until the number of divorces has been exhausted. That's the principle. So the number of divorces that we have is 3. So if you've reached 3, and then there's going to be a remarriage after the conditions we'll talk about shortly, then you come back and you restart. But if you've divorced and you've only had 1 or 2 divorces, you go on, even if you marry 1 or 2 people and divorce, etc., and come back to the first husband. In that case, you still come back with the same number of divorces. Why? Because divorce does not negate the number of divorces until the number is exhausted. Okay. And then the big lesson is also, if he divorces her 3 times, she remains unlawful for him until 5 conditions are met. So the first condition is, okay, so the man has divorced his wife. This is the third divorce. Whether it's 3 divorces in one pronouncement, which our madhab allows, or whether it's 3 separate divorces. Important thing for the discussion now is that he has divorced her 3 times, so it's irrevocable. It's ba'n. So the first condition is that that waiting period has to end. So the iddah there has to end. Either she's pregnant, she has to give birth, or she has to wait the 3 cycles. Number 2, she has to marry another man. And that has to be a sahih contract. So all of the conditions that we learned in the beginning of this chapter of marriage and divorce, those conditions have to be fulfilled in that contract. And number 3, that marriage is consummated sexually. And actually, and forgive the kind of intimate detail here, but Az-Zarakshi says that this is the one case in which full erection and penetration of the man to the woman is required. So it's not just because when we talked about the consummation of marriage requiring the returnal of the mahr or half the mahr in the cases of divorce, the Sharia was more flexible in what is constituted as consummation. Like even if it happened while they were sleeping, or he rolled over her and he penetrated her without intention or something like that. But in this case, specifically, it's much more specific, because the point is that she has entered into a new relationship. حتى يذوق عسيلته ويذوق عسيلتها. The Prophet ﷺ said in another hadith, until al-usayla is a euphemism or an allegorical term that the Prophet ﷺ used to talk about that she has tasted and he has tasted the intimate aspect of the relationship. So there has to be a full, let's say like full textbook consummation of the marriage. And I know this is like a super duper like detail that, why am I even mentioning it? But it's important because, as I always say, fiqh is a precise instrument. So I just wanted to mention that comes from Az-Zarakshi, which is one of the great fuqaha that we have. So the third condition is that it's consummated in the way that I mentioned. And number 4 is that she is divorced from the new husband. Now she's either divorced from the husband once or twice or 3 times, but there's a full divorce. And then the 5th condition is that waiting period has ended such that there is no automatic going back to him. Because if the new husband, divorced the wife once or twice, for example, and she hasn't finished the waiting period, she has like 10 days left in her waiting period, but he can take her back. So she is not free from him in that case. So in the original text of Abi Shuja, he says وَبَيْنُونَتُهَا مِنْهُ. So she is free and clear from him, either the 3rd divorce, which is final, in addition to the end of the waiting period. In that case, once these 5 conditions are concluded, the first husband can remarry the wife, and because we have exhausted the number of divorces and gone through these 5 conditions as is laid out in the Quran and the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, she comes back and the number of divorces is reset. Okay. And then they just, move on with their life and then repeat. All of the rules that we've been taking about will repeat. Is there anything else I wanted to mention to you about that? Okay. I think that's good. Now we're going to talk about the ila, or the forswearing. The first thing to mention is that it is a sin to do that, and there's a difference of debate, there's a difference of opinion in the madhab if it's a minor sin or the major sin, and he says, or Al-Bayjuri says at least, that the mu'tamad is that it's a minor sin, and this comes from the commentary of Imam al-Ramli in Nihayat al-Muhtaj radiyallahu anhum ajma'een. So this is not a good thing to do, okay? So just because the fiqh talks about it doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. For example, when you read in the Hawashi literature about marriage and divorce, you'll find when they talk about consummation, they'll always talk about does consummating include vaginal sex and anal sex, or only vaginal sex? Well, that doesn't mean that anal sex is halal, it's haram. But it's discussed. So not just because there's a discussion doesn't mean that it's necessarily something that's good to do. Because it's law and talking with the reality of the human condition and governing it. So ila or forswearing your wife is considered a minor sin. Why would you do that? Because you have to understand that the basic default understanding of marriage is that there's a safety in the contract. There's a safety in the marital union and rights and responsibilities and the man وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. Men have a degree over women, meaning a degree of responsibility. And so part of that responsibility is emotional responsibility, psychological responsibility, upkeep, so on and so forth. So this is why this is considered a sin to engage in that. Okay, so the forswearing is that the man can either say, I will, by Allah, I will not approach you anymore, or if I approach you, you can do it like as in a divorce pronouncement. If I approach you sexually, then you are divorced, or, so there can be like a swearing, an oath, and that's why one of the exits of it is going to be the expiation of that oath, because if you say an oath and then you don't, yameen, a halfa, you make an oath, and then you don't fulfill that oath, you have to expiate by paying 10 poor people or kiswatuhunna or tahrir raqaba, as the Quran says. And in the section of crimes and punishment of the fiqh book, we talk about that. So he can. There are different sigha, there are different verbiage that a man can do to forswear his wife. So he will say, like to repeat, I swear I will not approach you, or if I approach you are divorced, or or something like that. So if the husband forswears having intercourse with his wife forever, or a period exceeding 4 months, he has indeed forsworn her. So a man can stay away from his wife sexually up until 4 months, because one of the ways that we deal with problems in the marriage is فَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, as Allah Ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, that you stay away from them sexually. So you're allowed to do that, but not more than 4 months. So that's why the 4 months, which comes from the text of the Quran, is important. Excuse me. لِلَّذِينَ يُؤْلُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ تَرَبَّصُوا أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ. So the men who forswear their wife, let them wait, the women wait 4 months. So that's the golden number in this issue, which also informs other types of rights and responsibilities and issues that come up with a marriage. If a man is absent or not absent, or he's not tending to his wife's physical needs, emotional needs, etc. So 4 months becomes an important number. We'll pick up the discussion in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay, so the man forswears his wife or makes an oath that he's not going to approach her sexually forever, or he is very mad, he says forever or something like that. So we're going to wait for the 4 months to pass, because if he breaks the oath before the 4 months, then khalas, we're in the clear. He has to pay the expiation, but we don't have to force the divorce. But the point is that it's not fair for the wife that a man would engage in something like that for longer than 4 months. Let me just see the hashiyah. If a man also said to his wife, for example, I swear I will not approach you sexually except anally, or I will not approach you sexually except during your period or during your postnatal bleeding, all of that is a type of ila, forswearing, because those are impermissible types of intercourse. So there is detail in that. There's detail in the forswearing of the sexual act, and we'll come back to sort of what we said in the last clip about the fiqh being precise, and we talked about consummation, or we talked about sex, the act itself. We're going to take all of those they're all can be considered sex as a general topic, but there's only one halal act of penetration, and therefore the other ones, since they're haram, if a man swore that he would only approach his wife, for example, sexually when she had her period, that's as if he has forsworn her. So all of her rights will be guaranteed under this little section of the law that we're talking about. Okay, and as I said, or as Abi Shuja is saying, this comes from this is an area of law in which the judge becomes involved. So if a husband forswears having intercourse with his wife forever or for a period exceeding 4 months, he has indeed forsworn her. If she requests separation, he is left alone for 4 months. He is left alone for 4 months. And then he chooses, because we said 4 months is the maximum, because up until 4 months he can break his oath and then he can come back to her. So he is left alone for 4 months, and then he chooses between breaking his oath and making an expiation or divorce. He refuses, the judge issues a divorce for him. Okay, so the man swears that he's not going to do something. So if a man just says, I am not going to have sex with you ever again, that's an oath. So if you break that oath and he has sex with her tomorrow, then he has to pay an expiation for that oath. Kafaratul yamin. And that's from the text of the Quran. And in our madhab, it's about 500, 600 grams of food per person. And if there's a Muslim majority country and there's a fatwa office or a awqaf office or Islamic affairs office, usually every year they'll kind of determine, what that amount is determined as, so you know how much it would cost you to pay, to donate, to do that expiation. So it's not a good habit to swear to do something in general. The nadhr, if I get a good grade on this exam, I'm going to fast a day this month. That's called a nadhr. You have to do it, and the Prophet ﷺ said it's something that is an indication that you are stingy, al-bakhil, in the hadith literature, because he said, well, if you weren't stingy, you would have done that good work anyway. So it's not good that you get used to talking like that, to make a nadhr, or to make an oath and then to break it, because the Muslim is عند شروطهم. We are people that have to fulfill our oaths. So it's like another problem or another sin inside this ila, or this is one of the reasons why it's a sin. Anyway, so the man swears he's not going to approach his wife sexually either forever or only in a haram way or whatever, or more than 4 months, etc. And then if he breaks that, then he's going to have to expiate. So the exit for the ila, the exit for the forswearing the wife for the man is always going to involve the kafara if he returns to his wife, or he can divorce her. So this is a divorceable offense, is what the Sharia is trying to tell us. Now, if he doesn't either pay the kafara, or if he refuses to divorce her, or if he refuses to divorce her, he says, then the judge will force the divorce on his behalf. And again, because it's not fair for the woman to stay in that situation. So he can take her back by having intercourse with her, and then paying the expiation. As I said, the expiation is on him, not on her. If he had made a nadhr, if I ever have sex with you again, I will fast 60 consecutive days. Other than the fact that we said that there's a moral deficiency in that way of talking, according to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that it's a sign of being stingy, and he has sex with her, then he has to fulfill his nadhr. So paying back the expiation, it's either paying back, basically you have to pay for what you said. Either you made an oath and then you broke the oath because then you had sex with your wife, then you have to pay, or you made a nadhr, in which case you had sex with your wife, so you have to owe the nether that you said, if I ever have sex with you again, I'm going to give you the house, or something like that, or to give you the car, or free my slaves. That's usually the examples that they give. And then he has sex with his wife again. Then he has to fulfill those things. Now, if he refuses to fulfill those things, also the court is involved. Now, when it comes to a moral thing, like I'm going to pray tahajjud for the next month or something like that. I mean, it's hard to enforce something like that. But if it's some sort of transaction, like let's say freeing a slave, if a man says to his wife, if I ever have sex with you again, I'm going to free all of our slaves, and then the next day he regrets what he says and he has sex with his wife, he has to free all of his slaves. Now, if he refuses to free all of his slaves because that's a transaction, of course, automatically by having sex, the slaves are automatically free by that. The minute there's a penetration, if that was his oath, then the slaves are free. But if he refuses to fulfill that, then the judge intervenes. Or he can simply divorce his wife, right? Because if you're not going to have sex with her, why are you keeping her? Why are you still married to her? That's not right, because that's one of the fundamental rights and responsibilities of the marriage. If he refuses that, then also the judge intervenes and forces the divorce. It doesn't force an annulment. It's not a fasq, but in this case, it's a divorce, a talaq, and I skipped that by accident. And then whatever the judge pronounces is fulfilled. There's no way out of that unless there's like well, I guess you can't appeal something like this because it's straightforward fiqh. And then the judge will issue a one revocable divorce as long as there wasn't 3 fulfilled. If the man has divorced his wife 3 times prior, and then the judge twice prior, and then he did this forswearing thing, and he refused the divorce at the end of the 4 months, then the judge would issue the divorce. It would count as 3 divorces. So the judge in this case is issuing a divorce, one single divorce, and that is added to the ledger of divorces between the husband and the wife. If the wife had already been divorced twice, in this case the judge's divorce would be a 3rd irrevocable divorce. If she had been divorced once or twice, it just adds to that number until, as we said, the numbers are fulfilled, because the numbers of the divorces between a husband and wife have to be fulfilled before they're reset again through the 5 conditions of resetting the marriage. Okay, I think you guys get this. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Tomorrow we'll talk about the dhihar, which is a very peculiar thing that comes in Islamic law, and is almost something that is impossible to translate. So it's one of those things where you just have to learn what the term is. But we'll deal with that tomorrow. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, so in today's class, I backtracked a little bit by redoing the section of taking back one's wife. Partly because in yesterday's lecture I rushed through it, also partly because I need to make sure that we have enough material that fills all of the classes. So sometimes I will go back if in one class I happen to rush a little bit. I apologize for that. Usually in the beginning of the course recordings, it takes me about 3 classes to kind of get my rhythm going. So that's also just the human element. I apologize for the shortcoming. So we learned that if a man divorces his wife and she's in her waiting period, he can take her back as long as it's not a 3rd divorce. If the waiting period has ended and it's not a 3rd divorce, then he can take her back with a new contract. However, if the divorce is 3rd divorce, it's a final divorce, we have to follow those 5 conditions. I don't want to repeat them again, but you know what they are. And then we talked about forswearing one's wife. And this is where a man either makes an oath or a nether or swears that he will never approach his wife again sexually, or he puts some kind of condition: if I ever have sex with you again, I'm going to, give you all of my land and my property and my cars or whatever, or free a slave, etc. And then in that case, once he makes that pronouncement, we wait 4 months, because 4 months is the maximum that a man can stay away from his wife legally, sexually. At that case, then the man either goes back on his oath and pays the expiation, goes back on his oath by having intercourse with his wife. He has to have intercourse with his wife to go back on that, then pays the expiation, or he divorces her. And if he refuses to divorce her, then the judge issues one single divorce, and that single divorce is added to their ledger of divorce between the husband and wife. Of course, if there's any financial transactions that are linked to the man's oath, the judge also has the power to enact and force those sales and force the transfer of ownership in those cases. I think the example I gave you guys was the example of a slave. If I ever have sex with you again, I'll free all of our slaves. The next day he regrets what he says. He has sex with his wife, in which case he has to free all the slaves. He refuses to free him, then the judge intervenes and forces the manumission of the slaves. So there's some interesting fiqh in that, but I think it's also pretty straightforward. Not too many curveballs. And as I said, the next thing that we'll talk about is al-dhihar, which is a unique feature of Islamic law, which is comes back to the Arabic language, the Quran, the text of the Quran itself. We'll talk about that tomorrow, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.